Well, welcome to our three-part alfalfa live stream sponsored by L4X Seeds. Our topic is adapting alfalfa production to climate change. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, editor of Hordes Dairyman and member of the editorial team that produces and publishes Hay and Forage Grower and the Journal of Nutrient Management. We are broadcasting from our Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company building commissioned way back in 1908 by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Horde. When it comes to alfalfa, our company has deep roots with a forage crop as our magazine's founder, W.D. Horde, William Dempster Horde, was instrumental in growing alfalfa's popularity throughout the Midwest and transforming Wisconsin into America's dairyland. In fact, the governor's alfalfa research is the main reason the Hordes Dairyman Farm, which milks over 400 cows here, it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places by the U.S. Department of Interior in 1977. These days, alfalfa makes up a large portion of cattle rations across the country and around the world. And our team at Hordes is proud to produce these live streams with our friends from L4X Seeds. This alfalfa live stream will feature three speakers. Our presenters will welcome questions from our viewers in the final 15 minutes of our hour-long webcast. If you have a question of one of our speakers, please type it into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. I would first like to welcome Ron Cornish, General Manager of L4X Seeds. L4X Seeds and their partners provide ruminant and animal producers and commercial hay growers with agronomic support, education, and alfalfa varieties for today's growers. Thanks for joining us, Ron.
Hey, thank you, Corey. Glad to be here. I just would like to personally welcome you to Alfalfa Livestream webinar series sponsored by L4X Seeds today. This will be the last of our three alfalfa live streams webinars for now, but we hope we find the topics covered today of interest. And we know there are a lot of choices out there when it comes to choosing alfalfa and purchasing alfalfa seed. But one thing that sets us apart at L4X is our focus on alfalfa and other forages. We pride ourselves on being a leader in variety development with our connection back to our parent company, Corteva Agroscience, and their ability to deploy technologies and alfalfa used in other crops really gives us an advantage in the marketplace. We thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to watch this webinar today. Our intent is to provide you with some good information that can help you increase productivity on your own farm or your customer's farm. So we hope you'll find this webinar informative and take away some key points that you can use to help manage your alfalfa crop for greater profitability. So enjoy the webinar. Corey, back to you.
Thank you, Ron. And we're going to go straight to our first poll question here for our audience. What is the best way to manage alfalfa with limited water? Variety selection, apply water to limited cuttings, reduce acreage, or apply equal amounts of water across all cuttings. So go ahead and give that an answer. We can see here how many of our audience members have voted. So we'll wait until at least a good 50% of those vote here. And as that's taking place, we're going to look forward to having our first presenter on this very topic here. So let's go ahead and see what those poll results are. Michaela, who was our producer. So the top answer was apply water to limited cuttings. And we'll see what Ian has to think about that. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Ian Ray to Alfalfa Livestream. Ian is a professor of agronomy at New Mexico State University. He holds a degree in agriculture from that school where he now works and a master and PhD degrees in plant breeding and genetics from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. For 28 years, Ian's research has focused on genetic characterization and improvement of drought tolerance in alfalfa using molecular and conventional breeding approaches. Ian routinely conducts field-based experiments involving optimum, deficient, and termination irrigation management regimes. His program developed the alfalfa cultivar Numex Bill Melton, which has demonstrated high yield performance under variable soil conditions in the state of New Mexico. Since 2013, Ian has held the Billy and Lois Melton Endowed Chair in Plant Breeding, Genetics, and Drought Tolerance Research at New Mexico State University. Ian, I look forward to your conversation on drought strategies for alfalfa production.
Thank you very much, Corey. And it's a real pleasure to be with everybody today. And I hope I'm able to share some useful information with you. And as Corey said, what I'm going to be talking about is how can we manage hay when water is in short supply. So I'd like to break my presentation into three major topics. The first portion I'd like to discuss, how can we alter irrigation management strategies from optimum to suboptimum water allotments. And then I'd also talk about some other considerations that influence or are very pertinent to considering which irrigation management strategies might be suitable for you. And then I'll finish up by discussing how variety choice can potentially benefit altered irrigation management strategies. So let's start off with discussing irrigation management. And the first option I'll just talk about is, as if you're looking at the background here, we're collecting yield data in a variety trial that's been well watered. You can see the hay is actually well beyond when we should have gotten out there. But anyway, we've got high yields here. And so when water is in short supply, one of the questions that you want to, first thing that comes to mind is supplemental water available? And if it is, then you've got lots of flexibility to consider. And here we go. I'm waiting for the lag to get my animation going. So one of the things that some growers will consider doing is they'd like to maintain optimum irrigation the entire growing season long for high yields. But if you do that, that means there's going to have to be a portion of your acreage that you set aside and don't water. So you're going to have to reduce your irrigated acreage somehow. And the problem with that is the hay that you don't water can potentially be severely damaged. And that's going to depend on where your operation is located in the country. In hot desert areas, that's where the greatest damage is likely to occur. Our second irrigation option is, as you're looking here, you can see the hay is pretty short and we're harvesting it. And that's because we're evaluating what we call a season-long or chronic deficit irrigation management. And this is where you're going to take whatever water, let's say the state engineer has allocated to you, and you're going to stretch it out over the entire growing season. But if you do that, you're going to end up with consistently reduced yields unless, my slides are auto-advancing, unless significant precipitation occurs, all right? So our third irrigation management option is early termination. And I noticed that the most popular response to the poll was to irrigate fewer cuttings. And I would agree with that decision. And I'll talk about that right here. So with early termination, irrigation management, I'll give you an example for what we might do here in New Mexico. So what we would practice here is our first three cuts, April, May, and June, we would irrigate normally under favorable conditions. And that would give us, these are conditions that have good potential for high yield and quality. There we go. I'm wondering where my picture was. So here we've got well-watered alfalfa. But what's going to happen is then about midsummer, or I should say early summer, mid-June, through February of the next year, we're going to cut the water off. So there's going to be severe stress, 8 months with no water. In New Mexico, we'll lose about 4 of our cuts. And what I can tell you is the cumulative effect of this stress over time can result in yield reduction up here in our first 3 cuts in the spring. So keep that in mind. So when we cut the water off, this is what our fields look like, okay? No water, no growth. So with our fourth irrigation management option, it's similar to this option, except it's a little less severe. So this is our summer termination. So there's only going to be a much smaller period where we're not going to irrigate our hay. It's going to start off the same. We're going to water our spring cuts fully with the water that they need. We're going to be producing hay under favorable temps. So we're going to get good yields. We're going to get good quality And then what we're going to do in mid-June, let's say to early September, and again, the working example here is in New Mexico, is we're going to cut off the water at that point in time. And that's what our photograph is showing here. So no irrigation for about 3 months down here in New Mexico. And we're going to lose about 3 of our cuts. But the one thing to consider here is these are the harvests that give us the lowest yields and have the poorest quality. So if you're not putting water down under those conditions, maybe that cost benefit ratio, maybe that's okay. But here's where the systems differ between option 3 and option 4. In option 4 with summer termination, we're going to turn the water back on in the fall, for example, early September. We'll irrigate to late October so that we can produce good forage regrowth. We'll harvest. These are going to be under cooling temperatures, higher humidity, so we're going to have good yield and quality. And this provides an opportunity for our plants to recover from stress prior to winter. So the next thing I'd like to do is actually show you some data in terms of how do these types of irrigation management regimes impact production. And so I'll show you 3 examples here, the first of which is a variety trial where we were evaluating 24 alfalfa varieties under 3 different regimes. The first one you see in the very back of this field is control irrigation, where we're irrigating every 14 days. Here in the foreground, we've got chronic deficit irrigation managed alfalfa that's irrigated half as often. And then in the middle of this study are our early termination irrigation plots. So these receive similar irrigation as what we have back here in the back in the control environment, but we cut the water off in mid-June. So let's see how the hay performs under these conditions. And let's look at our control, because I'm going to compare all other options to our control situation. So under the control irrigation, well watered, we're harvesting 6 times per year. If we use the early termination strategy where we cut our water off in mid-June, obviously we're going to take a hit in yield, in part because we're only harvesting half as many times, 3 cuts per year. With our chronic deficit irrigation management, you see that we take almost the same reduction in yield, but under this irrigation regime, you'd actually be harvesting 6 times per year. So that's where you're trying to stretch your water out over the whole growing season. So now let's take a look at how much yield are we losing. And so in our first year, the first year of production, you can see that under both irrigation management regimes, we're losing about 30% of our yield in 2015 relative to our control. And then as we take a look at our second production year, 2016, we're losing about half of our yield relative to the control irrigation. And then in 2017, our third year of production, we're losing 50% under chronic deficit irrigation and almost 60% under irrigation termination. So one of the comments that I'll make here is, as we've talked with producers over the years, and we said, which of these alternative strategies would you favor? They say, we don't favor chronic deficit irrigation. Obvious, right? You're getting the same amount of yield, but you're having to go out, swath your hay, bale your hay. You're accruing expenses that aren't necessary under the early termination strategy where you're getting similar yields, but you're only having to harvest half as many times. So that's been the general consensus. And so that's what the poll indicated that folks thought was probably one of the good options. And so keeping that in mind, I'll come back to that variety study in just a minute, but I want to talk about some other considerations. The irrigation management strategy that you want to consider also always needs to be factored in with what are the soil types on your farm. If you've got very, how shall I say, fine textured soils, I'm talking here, let's say about sandy soils, all right? In certain environments, you might actually kill alfalfa, especially in hot, dry environments. For more moderately textured soils like loams, we've seen much less damage. So if you've got those quality soils, you're in pretty good shape. And our biggest challenge with heavy soils is that with the termination irrigation strategies where you water your fields, if you're on heavy soils, the soil particles are going to swell. Then as you terminate irrigation and the soils dry down, the particles are going to shrink. So we see severe cracking occurring. This makes for a very rough field. It's hard on the equipment, and it beats your operator to death when they're driving the equipment. I also want to just touch on irrigation methods, whether you might have flood irrigation options or sprinkler irrigation options. We know that there's pros and cons for both of these, but I'll just remind us that drip irrigation is also a method that is growing in popularity, definitely growing here in my part of the country, because it provides our greatest opportunity to apply water most efficiently. So drip irrigation is always an alternative to be thinking about. Also, and I know you all do this, but be thinking about rain. Down here, we don't get much rain, so all we think mostly about irrigation. But occasionally moisture does come out of the sky, and we want to be thinking about when does that occur and how much of it occurs. And so does it occur during the growing season, during the winter? Does it provide suitable soil moisture recharge? Also be thinking about what is the depth of the water table in your area. If it's relatively shallow, let's say 10 feet, alfalfa's got roots that can tap into that, and that can help you out during dry times. Also, if you're growing hay on, pardon me, okay, if you've got heavy textured soils, let's remember that if your water table is reasonably shallow, water can actually move up into the soil profile where alfalfa roots can extract that. We call that process capillary movement, where the water's moving against gravity. So then what I'd like to do with my final time here is talk about the utility of alfalfa varieties and their impact on production. And I'd like to use this slide to demonstrate two things. So first, let me just familiarize you with what you're looking at. This is the variety trial that I was talking to you about before. We're looking at productivity in our final year of production, 2017, under control irrigation management and under early termination. And so I've sorted these varieties from highest yielding varieties here in green font or green color to medium performing varieties under control irrigation in white, and orange rankings as our lowest yielding varieties. And so what I'd like you to take a look at is, as we look at the performance of these varieties, and these are just yield ranks. My apologies, the slides are auto advancing on me. We've got two varieties here that I've highlighted in yellow. And I want you to notice New Mexico Melton and Commercial Variety 1 are also among our highest yielding varieties under early termination. So their performance, they're still performing well. The other thing that I'd like to use these data to emphasize is that notice that in our third year of production, we're seeing that our high quality varieties have all moved into the lowest production category. And what I'd like to call your attention to is even varieties that were doing well under our control, irrigation management, or doing pretty well, they've moved into the lowest yielding category. And so keep those in mind as we talk about variety options. And so if you're growing for high forage quality varieties, be careful. They may be more sensitive to irrigation termination management. And this is because they've got more leaves, and so they're going to lose water more rapidly. So do your best to be able to water them well to maximize benefit to you and to not damage the stand. Also put them on your best soils if you've got that option. Loamy soils, ideally, where you've got good water holding capacity, and that way you can minimize stress. Then if you've got supplemental water available, let's think about, you do have the option to decrease irrigation acreage accordingly so that you can provide good water to at least part of that acreage. And if that's the option you choose, then currently available varieties, including high quality ones, are fine to utilize for that. But let's remember the acreage that you don't water could be seriously damaged. You also have the option to consider summer termination irrigation, where you can produce hay earlier in the season and later in the season. And this is where drought resilient varieties could potentially be beneficial. And for some reason, my slides aren't advancing. There we go. Okay, so drought resilient varieties may be useful here. Then as we go to my final slide, I hope. Okay. When water is in short supply, if you do not have the option for supplemental water, you're going to have to terminate irrigation. And this is where drought resilient varieties are going to give you your maximum benefit. All right, so they would be recommended. Now, here's one thing to consider. Okay, it looks like we've got a significant lag here. Our yield trials indicate that some of these types of varieties are commercially available. So that's good news. But the challenge is that we're not able to identify those types of varieties unless we conduct yield trials that evaluate them under termination irrigation management or deficit irrigation management. Here's the challenge, that for university variety trials, we're usually conducting these under normally irrigated conditions, all right? And so what this means is we've got limited information about what varieties are actually drought resilient. So I apologize that my texts aren't coming up on the slide when I need them to, but I'm going to close with what we are going to be able to do, and I'm totally confident in this, is that alfalfa breeders can actually select for alfalfa plants that can go into drought-induced dormancy, so that when water is not available, the plants go to sleep, they're able to survive, and then they're able to wake up, recover, and be productive when we apply irrigation water to them. So I'm confident we can achieve this. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my talk. I should be moving to my conclusion slide. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Samac. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just stay with us here. I got two questions that really are going to dovetail in here from our audience. In the early termination study, are the summer monsoonal rains calculated in your final yields? That's one follow-up.
In terms of the amount of water that's supplied, we do take that into consideration. I have to tell you that in the years that I showed you, we actually had very little monsoon rains. Our monsoon rains have disappeared by and large since about the year 2000. So I hope I answered that question sufficiently. So we do factor that in terms of the total amount of water that's applied, because it is extra, no doubt about it. And we do tend to get, when they do occur, they're going to be occurring in August and September. So great question.
And we're going to do one more real quick because it really ties into what you just talked about. What is your definition of HQ variety? Were these conventional products, or were they, you know, something like Harv Extra, or what? I mean, we don't want you to be giving out all the varietal names, but what was your definition of a HQ variety?
High quality variety was that has been reported when the variety was released through the National Alfalfa Variety Review Board. A claim has been made for high quality, either through high frequency of the multifoliate leaf trait, or large leaves, or selection for finer, more digestible stems. So they're covering the whole gamut, okay, in terms of the commercial products that are available out there for high quality varieties.
Thank you, Ian.
Okay.
And we'll look forward to asking you more questions later on. And let's go to, and as a reminder, we got those questions from people putting it into the GoToWebinar control panel. You can go ahead and type those in. And we're going to go to poll question number 2 here. And the poll question reads like this: what seed treatments do you consider important? Select one of the following: fungal treatments for damping off, fungal treatments for forage quality, fungal treatments for root rot diseases, standard seed treatments, or no treatments required. So go ahead and answer that poll question. We'll wait here until a good half of our audience answers that question. So, and as we're approaching that level here, go ahead and select your favorite seed treatment option. And as we're doing that, you saw that our next guest, Dr. Deborah Samac, has turned her video on here. So let's go ahead and show those poll results. And standard seed treatments top the list, but obviously that choice will change depending on the part of the country you're in, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So we're going to welcome Deborah to Alfalfa Livestream. She's a supervisory research geneticist with USDA's Agricultural Research Service in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she also serves as research leader for the Plant Science Research Unit. She received her PhD in plant pathology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Current research in Deborah's laboratory includes developing strategies for reducing damage from root and foliar diseases and mapping disease-resistant genes. Deborah, I look forward to your discussion, seed treatments in alfalfa for plant health and productivity. Welcome to Alfalfa Livestream, Deborah.
Great, thanks very much, Corey. Really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak with this group today. So I've been asked to talk about the value of seed treatments for alfalfa. Now, most of the alfalfa on the market today has one or more of these different seed treatments. And as you can see from this graphic, those seed treatments can add weight to the seed, resulting in fewer live seeds per bag than the untreated seed. So the question is, are these seed treatments worth it? Well, in my laboratory, we've investigated 3 different treatments: Apron XL for control of seedling damping off diseases, other fungicides such as Stamina for control of Aphanomyces root rot, and application of rhizobial cells for nodulation of alfalfa plants. And unless you're growing organically, I always recommend opting for the apron-treated seeds. This won't control all of the damping off problems that you have, but it will reduce the problem significantly. So we've looked at a lot of soils across the country for damping off problems. And where alfalfa is often in the rotation, we see soils like this that we call killer soils. And even though these seeds were treated with apron, we got a lot of damping off and seed rot. Now, obviously, this reduces the initial stand, but it also reduces winter survival and stand life, because the plants that do survive tend to have kind of forked roots, and they never develop that really good taproot that alfalfa needs for storing carbohydrates and for tapping deep water reserves. This is kind of a hidden disease problem because you'll see a poor stand establishment, but you really won't know the cause of it. And this seed rot and damping off problem is found when you have environmental conditions such as cold soil, planting into cold soil, or heavier soils that have a lot of soil moisture. And even if the plants do survive the initial damping off, they can continue to have root rot problems. So we did a deep dive into looking at what are the organisms that are causing these damping off problems. And so we baited the pathogens using alfalfa seedlings. And what we found was that of the 149 organisms that we isolated, about 2/3 of them were of Pythium species, while about 1/3 of them were Fusarium species. I gotta get rid of a cat. Now, what we found was that the Pythium species were mostly involved in causing the seedling death or damping off, while the Fusarium species were mostly causing seed rot. Now, as I said, these seeds were actually treated with Apron XL. So why didn't we get control? Because isn't Apron supposed to control Pythium? Well, what we found was that the Pythium species really vary in their aggressiveness and how bad they are on causing this problem, as well as their sensitivity to apron. So here's 2 different strains of a Pythium ultimum. And in this first trial, with untreated seed, we only got 2% germination, while it improved quite a bit with application of apron, but still didn't get 100% germination. The second trial used a different strain of Pythium ultimum, which was a little less aggressive, and we got better germination. But in field soil, you're going to have a mixture of these different strains of Pythium that have different aggressiveness as well as different sensitivity to apron. So apron was really introduced as a fungicide treatment on alfalfa seeds in the 1970s. And we wondered if some of the newer fungicides that are used on, say, soybean or dry bean might be more effective or have broader activity against these pathogens that we find in the killer soils. So we looked at about 15 different compounds that are currently on the market, and we found these 3 that seem to have broader activity against the pathogens that we're finding in alfalfa soils. So we had these applied to alfalfa seed commercially, and we tested Evergol Energy against apron, and then added Intego to apron, as well as Maximum and Intego to apron. And as you can see in the results of this experiment where we used one of these killer soils, we had low germination with an untreated seed as expected. And apron gave us pretty good control, about 60% germination. But adding into these other fungicide seed treatments did not significantly increase germination. So these experiments were done under greenhouse conditions where we're really favoring the pathogen. And so we are taking these seed treatments to the field to see how they perform under real world conditions. Now, the other disease that's of real concern, particularly across the northern tier of the United States. Oh, I'm sorry. Somehow I got all these slides advanced. So this Aphanomyces root rot is a disease of seedlings as well as adult plants. And so it reduces the initial stand density, but it can also rot off the fibrous roots and nodules of alfalfa plants, leading to symptoms of nitrogen deficiency. And currently we recognize 2 different pathotypes or races across the United States. And there is good resistance to one or both races in alfalfa cultivars. We wondered what the, oops, sorry, cat. We wanted to look at the protection of susceptible cultivars, and we utilized Stamina as a seed fungicide. And again, on a susceptible cultivar, we saw no control using apron, but we got good control of Aphanomyces using Stamina. And it was similar to the type of control that you can get in a resistant cultivar. So for Aphanomyces root rot management, you can select highly resistant cultivars, but if you are using a susceptible cultivar, use of Stamina can really reduce the seedling phase of the disease. Again, since this is a pathogen that that is worse in wet conditions, try to reduce soil moisture or plant into lighter soils, maintain high soil fertility, and undue stress to the plants. And the final topic I'll touch on is the persistence of the rhizobia that are applied to alfalfa seed. So we did an experiment where we looked at plants that were grown in 2 locations in Minnesota, Waseca and Lamberton, and we used a commercial seed inoculant. And these were planted into areas that had been in a corn-soybean rotation for over 30 years. So no alfalfa, although alfalfa had been in nearby locations. And when we looked at this soil, we found only about 100 to 1,000 of the Cynorhizobium bacteria per gram of soil, which is about a teaspoon. This is only about 1,000th of the bacteria that are found in the soil. So the rhizobia were in very low populations. So we sampled, we isolated the rhizobium bacteria from the alfalfa root nodules, and from about 1,000 of these nodules. And you can see the team here pulling the nodules off these roots. And we also isolated the rhizobia from the seed itself. And then we used a DNA fingerprinting technique to fingerprint these different bacteria. And what we found was that the rhizobia from these 1,000 nodules were very diverse. They somewhat were similar in these 2 different locations, but what really surprised us was that none of the strains in the nodules came from those seed treatments. So what this means is that the rhizobia in the soil were very competitive, outcompeted the rhizobia on the seed. So what can we conclude from these different research projects? Well, first, we found that Apron XL provides control of many, but not all of the seed rot and damping off organisms. there is a potential to identify fungicides that have greater activity against the seed rot and damping off organisms, particularly those fusarium isolates. And I didn't talk about this today, but we've been working on breeding for resistance to Pythium, and there is a good potential to develop resistance to Pythium species causing seed rot and damping off as an additional method of control. We found that stamina seed treatment does control Aphanomyces root rot on susceptible cultivars in the seedling phase. And we also found that indigenous rhizobia outcompete the rhizobia on the seed treatments. But there is potential to develop more competitive rhizobial inoculants. So with that, I will thank you and take any questions that you may have.
So I think there's a question here that's really a direct follow-up, Deborah, to your presentation here. And it reads like this: I see some alfalfa. It's not on the screen, so I gotta throw my glasses on. Talking about APH1 and APH2, some alfalfa companies are providing a rating for a race 3. How do I interpret this claim?
Yep. So when we plant out a variety that has resistance to both race 1 and race 2, or AF1 and AF2, sometimes we still get seedling or stand failures. And so it's been attributed that there might be additional pathotypes or races of Aphanomyces present. Right now, we have no varieties that will allow us to actually detect a different race. And when we have taken a look at those soils where they have failures of those race 1 and race 2 resistant varieties, what we find is that the failure is probably due to those Pythium species and Fusarium species causing damping off and seed rot. So there are multiple resistant Aphanomyces cultivars, but we have no way of identifying anything other than race 1 and race 2 at this time.
Taking that question a little bit higher to 30,000 feet, if my stand failed, what can I do to determine the problem? How does one investigate that? How would you describe that?
Yeah, so there is right now there's a bioassay that we can do to let you know if you have race 1 or race 2 Aphanomyces present in the soil. Can also detect Phytophthora, another root rot organism. And I have a student right now looking at quantifying the amount of Pythium that we have in the soil. So we can, at this point, identify what pathogens are present so that you can, take some more management methods to try to reduce some of these soil-borne pathogens.
Okay, well, very good. Let's go to our next poll question and bring Joshua on board. Poll question reads like this: is alfalfa being considered for carbon credits in the future? Real simple, yes or no. Go ahead and answer that poll question. And as the audience goes ahead and do that, I'll invite Joshua to turn on his webcam so we're ready to roll with his presentation. The votes are coming in fast and furious here. We'll wait a little bit for people since it's running so hot. And we'll give everybody about 5 more seconds to go ahead and answer that poll question. And I know Joshua will share some insight onto that. So let's go ahead and cut that poll off and see the results, where 84% said yes and 16 said no, and maybe we should have had a maybe up there. But Dr. Joshua Gamble, welcome to Alfalfa Livestream. Joshua is also a research agronomist for USDA's Agricultural Research Service in St. Paul, Minnesota. And Joshua's current research includes agroecosystem, level carbon and nutrient cycling, impacts of manure management and perennial forages on water quality and soil health, and sustainable dairy forage systems. Joshua, I look forward to your presentation on alfalfa as it relates to carbon credits.
Great, thanks so much, Corey, and I'm really glad that I could be here today to give this talk. Yeah, so as Corey mentioned, I want to talk about the potential for alfalfa and carbon credits, but I want to start by talking just a little bit about why we're interested in carbon credits in the first place, right? And then how do we actually measure changes in soil carbon or the carbon balance of an agricultural system? So I really just want to provide a little bit of context. So seems like based on the poll results that folks are well aware of this discussion, right? If you've been paying attention to the media, you've likely heard a lot about different carbon credit and offset programs like the ones I have listed here. It's estimated that right now there's over 100 voluntary carbon markets and 60 different pricing solutions that have emerged over the last couple of years. So it's a pretty hot area of development in the industry. And of course, the idea is that we can pay farmers to implement management practices that increase soil organic matter, right? If we increase soil organic matter, we increase carbon storage in the soil. The idea is that then this carbon can serve as an offset for other agricultural emissions or potentially emissions from other sectors of the economy. Now, a lot of these programs that have come online are focused on the use of cover crops and reduced or no tillage management. Those are kind of the most common ones being promoted, though there are a few that include perennial crops like alfalfa, such as the True Terra program, for example. From a scientific standpoint, however, I'd say that one of the largest issues that we're still facing is how do we verify that carbon storage actually takes place when a management practice is implemented? And I'll talk more about that. And you can see on the right here, this figure shows different measurement, reporting, and verification protocols. So that's directly focused on this. How do we verify, right? We can go out and measure things in the field, which is labor intensive. We can model it, which is, has its own sets of uncertainties. We can use hybrid approaches. So there's a variety of different ways that we need to be thinking about how do we verify carbon credits. So I want to talk a little bit about what we call climate smart agriculture, right? And that sort of gives a little more context to this issue. The idea is that, with increasing our soil organic matter, we're not just offering up carbon credits, right? We're also offering adaptation, right? There's a benefit to the producer, to the farm, to the soil of increasing soil organic matter, right? When we increase soil organic matter, we typically have greater porosity and aggregate stability in our soils. This can increase water and nutrient retention, and over time lead to greater plant productivity and yield stability. So soils that provide greater yield stability over time are more resilient to change. So there's this component of adaptation and resilience associated with increasing our soil organic matter. And then, of course, reducing emissions, right? Like I mentioned, we're storing more carbon in the soil, we're offsetting emissions elsewhere. So what do we mean when we say soil organic carbon sequestration? I want to go over this a bit. This is important for our discussion. So carbon sequestration is a process in which CO2 is removed from the atmosphere by plants and stored in the soil carbon pool. Now, the term organic just implies that it's plants doing the work. We also have inorganic carbon in our soils in the form of carbonate minerals. We're not so much talking about those for this discussion. And so if you look at the figure on the right, this is just a little schematic. Our alfalfa plant here, takes CO2 out of the atmosphere via photosynthesis. We harvest a portion of that material, of course, and then the remainder of that carbon then can be returned to the soil in the form of roots and other types of plant litter, right? In corn, we've got stover and cobs and things that are often left on soils. That plant litter contributes to soil organic carbon. Some of that carbon turns over pretty rapidly, so the microbes decompose it quite fast, and we get respiration. We get CO2 loss back to the atmosphere. We get that from both the plant and soil microbes, actually. But some of that carbon turns over more slowly in the soil. It gets associated with minerals like clay. It gets bound up in soil aggregates. We've got good soil structure, and it sticks around for longer periods of time. This is typically, when we say sequestration, this is the carbon we're talking about. Longer term storage. There's a time component here. And of course, this process results from the interactions of all these ecological processes, soil, climate, and then of course human activities like agriculture. Oops, I jumped the wrong way. So of course, agriculture can influence soil organic carbon through crop selection and rotation, the type, frequency, and timing of tillage, right? Irrigation and soil drainage, which impacts soil and water content, or sorry, water and air content of our soil, right? So that affects our microbial processes in the soil. And then through organic amendments, of course, too. If we're adding manures or mulches to the soil, that's adding carbon to the soil. So we can influence this process. But as I mentioned, there's one of the big barriers to sort of adopting these large scale programs for accounting for changes in soil carbon is that we really don't have great methods for reliable measurement and monitoring, right? This is a barrier. We can do these things on a research scale or on an individual scale pretty reliably, but if you're talking about thousands of acres or millions of acres across the country, it's a lot more complicated. The soil carbon stock is large, especially here in the Midwest. Gains in response, or gains and losses in response to management, are quite slow. So the signal to noise ratio is small, right? And there's just a lot of variability related to terrain, to water, soil type, weather patterns, and management. So capturing that variability is a challenge. So I'll just talk briefly about how we actually do that. And so most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with soil sampling. This is how we would do a soil carbon inventory. We go out with our hydraulic probe truck. We core as deeply as we can into the soil, at least a meter, if not more, depending on the soil depth. We bring those samples back to the lab. We dry them down. We combust them in an analyzer like this, and we measure the CO2 that comes off, and we can calculate a soil carbon change over time, before a management practice, after a management practice, right? So we can calculate that change over time. There's a lot of uncertainty with that process as it relates to how we handle our samples and the type of analyzer, but also the spatial variability I mentioned, right? These are actually 2 dairy forage production fields that I worked to map soil carbon in. And you can see that the soil carbon values vary 5-fold over these 2 fields. On our top slopes, we've got relatively low soil carbon values of about 20, this is metric tons per hectare. And in our lower portions of the landscape, the sort of prairie pothole soils in western Minnesota, we've got over 100 tons, right? So there's a huge amount of variability in these fields. So to capture that variability, we have to sample pretty intensively each year. So this is 98 soil sampling locations across these fields. We sample in 4 different soil depths. It gets to be a pretty intensive process. So we're looking at other methods as well. We're working with this method called the Eddy covariance method, where rather than directly measuring the change in soil carbon, we're sort of inferring it based on sort of like a checkbook method, inputs minus outputs, right? We've got photosynthesis coming in, respiration going out. We can measure that with this type of sensor here. It's an infrared gas analyzer. We put above a crop canopy. We measure our wind speed and direction, and we can calculate how much CO2 is coming in, how much is going out. We then account for how much we're harvesting and how much we might be adding in manure, and we can calculate what we call a net ecosystem carbon balance. And this is basically the implied change in soil carbon, right? It's just another, it's like a checkbook method of calculating that change. This method has its own sources of uncertainty, of course, like any method. There are other methods that have been developed, recently too, focused on like remote sensing, satellite and drone remote sensing imagery to detect changes in soil carbon. Those methods have some promise. However, they're mostly focused on surface soil. So if we're really interested in total changes in carbon, we need to go deeper than the surface. So with all that said, what is the role of alfalfa? What does the data say right now? So this figure is an aggregation of 25 different research studies that range in duration of time. It looks like some things got a little cut off here, but along this x-axis, we see this is the duration of the study in years. So we've got studies up to 60 years long. And we've got 2 different types of studies. We've got our soil carbon sampling studies and our net ecosystem carbon balance studies done with that flux method I mentioned. And then along this axis, we see the tons of carbon per acre per year gain or loss. So 0 would be no change, right? Negative values indicate carbon loss, positive carbon gain. And the first thing we see is that our flux studies are generally shorter term so far. It's a newer method, but they're showing losses. On average, a loss of about 0.4, almost a half a ton of carbon per year. But again, these are shorter term studies. Our longer term studies are soil carbon studies, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. If you look at the average of all those studies, it shows a slight gain, although our error bounds include 0, right? But if you look at these longer term studies, there's definitely an indication that yes, indeed, when we've got alfalfa in rotation with primarily annual crops, you can sequester carbon. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty with both of these different methods. And so working through how do we reconcile the different methods of accounting is an important piece that needs to be worked on. I'll show a couple slides here of some of my own data now. This is actually from this past growing season. We had 2 adjacent fields, one in silage corn, one in alfalfa. And this figure shows the daily carbon balance. So we're monitoring that CO2 flux to and from the field, and then also accounting for what we harvest. So we'll start with the silage corn, the yellow line. We see that pretty slow going. We've got, I don't remember our exact planting day, but we see here early in the season, we've got slight losses due to soil respiration. But once that crop starts growing, we've got pretty rapid accumulation of carbon, right? A lot of biomass being produced. Then at the end of the year, we've got one large silage harvest, and that's this steep line right here. We're taking a lot of carbon off. And then in the end, we show we've got a negative carbon balance in our silage corn, right? So that remaining plant residue after we harvest most of that above ground material isn't sufficient to offset our losses in respiration, right? That's a negative carbon balance. In our alfalfa system, we had 3 harvests, although the third one was pretty nominal at best. If you remember this last year, it was pretty droughty that time of year. But you see that we had a couple cuts. We had a one cut early in June. We have photosynthesis occurring again, another cut in early July. Took a small cut just to clean things up in the middle of the season. And then we see once we got some rainfall that alfalfa took off again, which was nice to see. And we had a positive carbon balance in that field this year. And actually that's 2 years running in that field. We've had a positive carbon balance. So indicating that over the long term, we should be increasing our carbon storage in that field. This is for rain-fed alfalfa. We've done this work in irrigated alfalfa too, and we've actually seen sort of the opposite result, at least in terms of the alfalfa. This figure shows both the inputs and outputs that I've showed in the previous schematic figure, right? So we've got photosynthesis in blue, that's the carbon coming into the system. We've got manure coming into the system in the light blue. We've got our exports from the system, including our soil and plant respiration in the dark yellow, and then our harvest in the lighter yellow. That's the carbon removed in harvest. The red bars show the net change. So again, our silage corn system is losing a little over 2 tons in this case in an irrigated system. And in this case, our alfalfa was losing carbon as well. And this is an average of 6 site years for alfalfa and I think 15 for the silage corn. So this suggests that in irrigated situations, we're going to be losing soil carbon on this soil type anyway. And so this is just to point out that there's still uncertainty, right, in our estimates. Is it irrigated? Is it not? What soil type is it being grown on? What is the crop rotation? This was just a silage corn and alfalfa rotation over time. The other crops in the rotation could have an impact. So to conclude, improving soil carbon storage is important, not just for carbon credit programs and greenhouse gas mitigation, but it's also important for your soil health and the resilience of your soils, right? Alfalfa can improve carbon balances. We've seen from a variety of studies under certain circumstances that's true, but we do see losses in certain circumstances as well. So what this points to is really that we just need more site years of alfalfa with these modern methods. And we also need to think about how do we integrate and reconcile these methods, right? We're getting different results, slightly different results with different methods or different durations of study. We need to reconcile those methods and come up with sort of an integrated solution for how we do this. And then finally, scaling these inventory methods is a challenge. When we think about these larger carbon credit programs, I have to wonder, about the different approaches they're taking, whether it's something that we could conceivably do on thousands or millions of acres. There's still, from a scientific standpoint anyway, I think, work to do to better understand how we do this. And I should highlight that this uncertainty is not just related to alfalfa. When we're talking about our estimates for soil carbon change with cover crops, with tillage management, or any other agricultural management, there's uncertainty around all of those issues right now. So there's work to be done across the board. So with that, I think I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Josh, well, we'll invite Ian and Deborah to turn their webcams on, but while they're doing that, we're gonna bring the first question to you. So you did some comparisons between alfalfa and corn silage. Audience member asks, have you considered this? And there's so many different variables. I know what soil and what crops and whether it's irrigated or traditional, rainfall, but are there, consider like carbon credits in the case of alfalfa, saying plowing under a poor stand in spring for nitrogen. This is a 3-year alfalfa stand. Then coming back with a rotation of corn that's maybe plowed under soybeans and then coming back to alfalfa. Have you looked at anything in that nature?
In terms of the longer term rotations, yeah, we're looking at longer term rotations. And I think that's a really important point. So it's a great question. It's not just about the individual crops. Those dynamics that play out over whatever your longer rotation is matter. What tillage you're using in your corn might impact the carbon balance for the subsequent alfalfa, and vice versa, right? And so it's not just about getting a number for that individual crop. It is about thinking about those longer term rotational dynamics. So we are doing some of that work, looking at how the diversity in your rotation, it matters, and that, the impact of the different crops, their different rooting depths, how you manage your tillage. We are looking at some reduced and no tillage options, how we can terminate alfalfa without tilling. If we can just spray it out and get something no tilled into it, does that have an impact on that subsequent, say, corn crop carbon balance? Those are important factors, and we are looking at that. I don't have a lot of data right now, though.
Ian, this question's for you. Does salinity tolerance have any effect to drought tolerance in commercial alfalfa varieties?
That's a great question, because drought and salinity are what we call osmotic stresses. And so if you've got high salt, the plant has to work extra hard to extract moisture from the soil. And if you have dry soils, the plant has to work extra hard. So you would think there would be, but in terms of seeing hard evidence that would indicate that just selecting for increased salt tolerance will improve drought tolerance, the results, it's a mixed bag, because oftentimes you have to always factor in how adaptable were the materials that were compared. So I've not seen control studies that were designed, how shall I say, specifically enough to address that question. But I would say a gut feeling would be that if you have improved salinity tolerance, you should have some degree of improved drought tolerance as well, because plants are going to use similar mechanisms to at least combat some of that. One of the ways that alfalfa can respond to drought is it can just put its roots down deep and explore large soil volumes. And that's more of a drought escape mechanism. But when the water's not there, or if you have high salt, the way the plant's going to try to be getting moisture out of the soil is it's going to be reducing its potential energy within its cells by increasing carbohydrate content, soluble, even salts and so forth. And this can help the plant to actually be able to suck moisture out of the soil. So I would say, in general, that's a fair assumption to make, but I've not seen how substantial that impact might be. And it's definitely worth, that might be something that could be worth the alfalfa research group has got funding that could actually look at this. So we could contact the North American Alfalfa Improvement Conference and USDA, and that's definitely a great topic that we could look for some research dollars for. So that's my response right there. It depends.
Next question's for Deborah. Are aggressive rhizobia only found in fields without previous alfalfa history and no previous inoculant? Or might you expect the indigenous rhizobia are the dominant in previous alfalfa fields?
See if I understand the question correctly. So there are very competitive rhizobia for nodulating alfalfa, basically in all soils. So the ones that are introduced on seeds tend to not become established in the soil, as well as the ones that are already there. So if you went into completely virgin soil that didn't have any rhizobia, you could establish some of those that were from a commercial inoculant. But it's really hard to establish the rhizobia from a commercial inoculant into a field that already has rhizobia present with our current strains. But there are people working to develop strains that are more competitive as well as high nitrogen fixing. So there's hope on the horizon.
All right, we got some more questions here. We're going to move the speed round here, so responses in about 30 to 40 seconds. The next one is going to go to, we're going to send this to Joshua. Is increased carbon loss due to power consumption and irrigation? That's not quite making sense there. I'm looking on a screen. Actually, is increased carbon loss, so you saw the carbon loss there. I think I'm going to interpret this question here. You saw it in alfalfa, you saw it in corn silage. Is there some kind of interaction happening when it's on irrigated acres versus traditional rainfall? Let's go with the question that way.
Yeah, well, I think maybe what the question was originally hinting at was the you know, that there are emissions associated with pumping that water, right? But we're not accounting for that here. This is my analyses are really soil focused, so it's not a larger carbon footprint that encompasses the whole farming system. I'm just focused on the soil carbon balance itself. So then to get at your question, and Corey, yeah, there's some interaction. I think, you know, when you're irrigating soils, you're potentially accelerating respiration. So the microbes in the soil do better under moist field conditions, right? You know, you get them too wet, they stop. But under optimal conditions, they're most active. So I think that might be what's going on with the data I showed.
Let's stick right with you there on this other one, because you said there are some of the 60 or so markets out there for carbon. There's a few of them that are talking about alfalfa. And this question reads, I hear uncertainty is the constant in carbon sequestration in soils. Is contracting with the high level of uncertainty even possible or enforceable?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not the expert there, certainly. I would say, though, that there are a few programs that are approaching it slightly differently, where they're not necessarily contracting per ton of carbon or you know, looking for a direct measurement outcome. Some of them are really just doing it practice-based. In fact, there's a program in Australia where they'll pay the producers to implement certain practices regardless of the outcome. The assumption is that there's a positive outcome. It might not be the exact one we hope for in terms of carbon, but maybe there's, you know, when we look at, say, cover crops, we know there are other benefits, even if it's not necessarily carbon balance related, right? So there's different strategies that are being tried. So I guess that's the short answer.
Deborah, this is a loaded question to tackle in 30 seconds, but give it a whirl. Is there any point of inoculating seed at the time of planting if rhizobium species is or are the same ones that seem to be ineffective when the seed is pre-inoculated?
At the risk of alienating colleagues in the seed treatment industry, you know, you're not really going to get much nodulation from the seed treatment.
The question came in late about who's going to be policing carbon programs. I'm going to be real candid here. We're not at the point of policing. You, as a farmer or alfalfa grower, you have to be very vigilant. This is kind of the wild, wild west of immigrant America right now, and this is an evolving target. If you're unsure of something here, I would sit on the sidelines and study it, because it's an important matter. I'll just ask any of our panelists if they want to say any more on the end of that question.
Well, yeah, I would just say that right now, this is mostly industry-led, right? You know, from our perspective at USDA, we're doing some research on carbon balance in agricultural systems, but we're not really involved, you know, in this issue of policing. I mean, it's the industry, you know, if one of these private companies wants you to pay you to implement a practice, I guess it's on them if they need to verify, right? So, you know, it's industry-led at this point. Yeah, you're right, Corey. We're not anywhere near any sort of policing point, you know, on any of this. So,
as a daily reader of the Wall Street Journal, you know, I'll add this. This is an area that there's more money and investor input and research being put into anything before. We have a lot to learn, and people like Joshua will be doing that. And here's our final question, and I got to figure out who's going to answer it, but we'll go ahead and read it. Generally, how much are we helping recover or slow the loss of SOC? So we must be talking soil carbon here. If we're using ryegrass or triticale and harvesting that crop before growing corn silage. So we're double cropping here. What is that impact, Joshua?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think again, as with the other systems, there's still uncertainty, but I think in general, in situations where we're double cropping, there tends to be a benefit, right? So you think about it in terms of, how much solar radiation we have coming in through the year. If we've got 2 crops out there instead of 1 during a given growing season, we're maximizing how much carbon the plants are taking up. We're maximizing the amount of root biomass that's being put down into the soil. And so generally that's a positive benefit, but then we have to think about these other issues, tillage management, irrigation management, et cetera, in terms of how everything actually plays out in the end. But generally, yes, the more plant growth, the better.
Well said. Well, thank you to the audience for their insightful questions. We did answer all the questions up to this point, and thank you for our speakers for the answers you provided. If the audience has any additional questions, you certainly can put those on the survey that I'm going to talk about, and we'll get those to our experts here for an answer. Following the webinar, audience members will receive that short survey about our program. Please fill that out to help us better serve you in future webinars. There'll be just it'll take 1 or 2 minutes. Some of these surveys come in and they take you 10 to 15. This is a short one. We want instant feedback from you. Give us a rating, 1 to 5. 1, we didn't do so hot. 5, we were rock stars. And the other questions are: did you find this webinar to be informative? Did the presenters provide useful information for your decision-making process? Was the webinar the appropriate length for the topic covered today? And then we just have an open-ended question for anything else you would like to share. Thank you in advance for completing that survey. And on behalf of Ron Cornish, Ian Ray, Deborah Samac, and Joshua Gamble, I'm Corey Geiger, your host. Thank you for joining us on Alfalfa Livestream. We wish you all a good day. Goodbye, everyone.